The winter of 1944 pressed down on the Ardennes forest like a cold, unforgiving hand. Snow clung to the pine branches, and the air carried that peculiar silence that comes before something terrible is about to happen. In a hastily fortified position near the Belgian village of Rocherath, a young American Army mechanic named Private James Mitchell sat hunched over a German MG-42 machine gun, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The weapon before him was a trophy of war, captured 3 days earlier during a fierce skirmish with retreating German forces. While his fellow soldiers celebrated their prize, Mitchell saw only a problem. The MG-42, nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw for its terrifying rate of fire, was useless without a functioning feed mechanism. The metallic belt system that carried ammunition into the weapon's chamber had been damaged, its delicate wire spirals bent and broken, rendering the fastest-firing machine gun of the war nothing more than an expensive paperweight. Mitchell was 22 years old, born and raised in the industrial town of Gary, Indiana, where his father worked in the steel mills, and his grandfather had been a railroad mechanic. Before the war, James had spent his evenings in his father's garage, taking apart lawnmower engines, fixing neighbors' broken radios, and dreaming of one day opening his own repair shop. Now, those same hands that once fixed kitchen appliances were tasked with keeping instruments of destruction operational in the frozen hell of the European theater. The American forces were stretched thin. Intelligence reports suggested something big was coming, though no one could say exactly what or when. Every weapon mattered, every advantage counted. The MG-42, if they could get it working, would give them a significant edge. Its rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute far exceeded anything the Americans had. But the belt feed system was unlike anything Mitchell had worked with before. The German engineering was brilliant and frustrating in equal measure. The Gert 3441 belt links were made of stamped steel, incredibly thin at just half a millimeter thick, connected by wire spirals that allowed the belt to flex as it fed through the weapon. When it worked, it was poetry in motion. When it broke, it was nearly impossible to repair without proper tools and replacement parts, neither of which existed in their forward position. Mitchell had spent the better part of 2 days studying the mechanism, trying to understand how the Germans had designed it. The feed pawls needed to grab each belt link precisely, pulling the ammunition through in a smooth, continuous motion. Any irregularity, any snag or hesitation would cause a jam that could prove fatal in combat. The wire spirals were the key. They allowed just enough flexibility for the belt to curve and feed while maintaining the rigid structure needed for reliable feeding. But 3 of the wire spirals were broken, and another 4 were so badly bent they would never feed properly. Mitchell had already tried straightening them, but the thin steel had lost its temper from the damage and simply wouldn't hold its shape. He needed replacement parts, but the nearest supply depot was 30 miles away, and with the weather deteriorating and enemy activity increasing, no supply runs were getting through. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Robert Hayes, was a pragmatic man who had learned in the harsh months since Normandy that sometimes the rule book had to be thrown out the window. He had given Mitchell permission to cannibalize any non-essential equipment to get the gun working, but so far nothing had proven suitable. The American ammunition belts were completely incompatible, using a different system entirely. There was no spare German equipment to scavenge. Mitchell was stuck. It was Sergeant Bill Kowalski who first mocked the idea. Kowalski was a veteran of North Africa and Sicily, a man who had seen enough combat to be confident in his opinions and dismissive of anything that seemed unconventional. He found Mitchell in the dimly lit barn that served as their makeshift workshop, surrounded by pieces of the disassembled MG-42. "Still playing with that German toy?" Kowalski asked, his voice carrying the rough edge of a lifelong smoker. "You know we've got perfectly good Brownings. Why waste time on that thing?" Mitchell didn't look up from his work. Because the Browning fires 500 rounds per minute, and this fires 1,200. In a defensive position, that's the difference between holding a line and getting overrun. Kowalski laughed, a harsh bark that echoed in the cold barn. Yeah, well, it doesn't fire at all if you can't get it working, does it? Face it, kid. You need parts you don't have. Time to give up and focus on keeping our own equipment running. Pfeast, but Mitchell couldn't let it go. There was something about the challenge, something about the elegant brutality of the German design that captivated him. More than that, he had a gnawing feeling in his gut that they were going to need every weapon they could muster very soon. The forest was too quiet. The German prisoners they'd captured had been too confident, even in defeat. Something was coming. Late that evening, Mitchell sat alone in the barn, a single kerosene lamp providing the only light. The cold had driven everyone else to seek shelter in the stone farmhouse nearby, but he couldn't bring himself to leave the problem unsolved. He turned one of the broken wire spirals over in his fingers, studying it in the lamplight. The wire was thin, probably about 1 millimeter in diameter, and it had been formed into a tight spiral before being hardened. It needed to be strong enough to hold the belt links together under tension, but flexible enough to allow the belt to curve through the feed mechanism. Steel wire was the obvious choice, but where could he find steel wire of the right diameter and properties in a war-torn Belgian forest? His eyes drifted to the kerosene lamp. It was a simple device, the kind that had been used for decades before electricity became common. The brass base held the fuel, and the wick assembly was surrounded by a glass chimney. But what caught his attention was the wire bail handle that allowed the lamp to be carried. It was made of sturdy steel wire, formed into a graceful loop. An idea began to form, crazy and improbable, but an idea nonetheless. Mitchell picked up the lamp and examined the wire handle more closely. It was thicker than what he needed, probably 1.5 millimeters, but it was definitely steel, and it had the right kind of springiness. His mind raced through the possibilities. If he could somehow reform the wire to the right diameter and create the spiral pattern, it might work. The next morning, Mitchell approached Lieutenant Hayes with his idea. The lieutenant listened, his weathered face showing the skepticism of a man who had learned to be cautious about unconventional solutions. "Lamp wire," Hayes said flatly. "You want to fix a German machine gun with lamp wire." "Not just any lamp wire, sir. The kerosene lamps we requisitioned from the village, they have steel wire handles, good quality steel. I think I can work it down to the right diameter and form it into the spirals the belt needs." Hayes was quiet for a long moment, his breath steaming in the cold morning air. Finally, he said, "You've got 24 hours, Mitchell. After that, we box up that German gun and forget about it. We've got more important things to worry about." Mitchell saluted and hurried back to the barn, his mind already working through the steps he would need to take. First, he needed to acquire several lamps without arousing too much attention. The last thing he needed was more mockery from the other soldiers. He managed to quietly collect 3 kerosene lamps from various positions, claiming they needed new wicks. Back in his workshop, he carefully removed the wire handles using a pair of pliers. The wire was indeed good quality, with a nice spring to it that suggested proper tempering. The first challenge was reducing the diameter. Mitchell didn't have a proper wire drawing die, but he did have a selection of files and a lot of patience. He secured the wire in a bench vise and began filing it down, working slowly and carefully to maintain a consistent diameter. It was painstaking work. Each spiral required about 8 inches of wire, and he needed to make 7 replacements. That meant he had to prepare more than 4 feet of wire to the exact right diameter. Hours passed. His hands cramped from the repetitive motion. The temperature in the barn seemed to drop even further as night approached. Mitchell's fingers grew numb, but he pressed on, checking his work constantly with a micrometer he had borrowed from the motor pool. Sergeant Kowalski stopped by around midday, accompanied by 2 other soldiers. Word had spread about Mitchell's lamp wire trip, as they were calling it. The three men stood watching him work, their expressions ranging from amused to openly contemptive. "This is what passes for Army mechanics these days?" one of them, a corporal named Jensen, said with a laugh. "Kid thinks he's going to fix a German machine gun with lamp wire. What's next? Patching tanks with chewing gum?" Kowalski shook his head. "I told the lieutenant this was a waste of time. We should have Mitchell working on actual priorities, not playing around with captured junk." Mitchell kept filing, refusing to engage. He had learned early in his military service that arguing with combat veterans was pointless. The only thing that mattered was results. Either his idea would work, or it wouldn't. Words were cheap. "The kid doesn't even have the sense to defend himself," Jensen continued. "Lieutenant Hayes is too soft, letting him waste time on this nonsense. In North Africa, we would have been court-martialed for this kind of foolishness." After they left, their laughter echoing across the frozen ground, Mitchell allowed himself a moment of doubt. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was wasting precious time and resources on an impossible task. The German engineering was so precise, so carefully calculated. How could he possibly replicate it with improvised materials and crude tools? But then he thought about his grandfather, the railroad mechanic who had kept ancient locomotives running long past their expected service life through sheer ingenuity and determination. His grandfather had taught him that engineering wasn't about having perfect tools or ideal conditions. It was about understanding principles and finding creative solutions. By evening, Mitchell had successfully reduced 7 pieces of wire to approximately 1 millimeter in diameter. The next challenge was even more daunting, forming them into the precise spirals needed for the belt feed. The German spirals were tightly wound, probably using a specialized machine. Mitchell would have to do it by hand. He fashioned a simple winding mandrel from a piece of steel rod that was close to the right diameter. Then, using 2 pairs of pliers, he began carefully winding the wire around the mandrel, trying to maintain consistent spacing and tension. The first attempt was terrible. The coils were uneven and loose. He unwound it and tried again, and again. It took 17 attempts before he produced a spiral that looked even remotely similar to the German original. His hands were blistered, his eyes strained from working by lamplight, and his back ached from hunching over the bench for hours. But he had 1 usable piece, 6 more to go. Mitchell worked through the night, driven by a combination of stubbornness and growing anxiety. The forest was too quiet. Even the usual sounds of distant artillery had faded. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to begin. By dawn on December 16th, he had completed all 7 wire spirals. They weren't perfect, not by any measure. The coils weren't quite as tight as the German originals, and there was some variation in the spacing, but they had the right general shape and the right flexibility. Now came the real test, installing them and seeing if they would actually work. Mitchell carefully assembled the belt, threading the improvised wire spirals through the links. His hands shook slightly from exhaustion and anticipation. If this didn't work, he had wasted 2 days that could have been spent on other repairs. More than that, he would have to endure the mockery of men like Kowalski, who would never let him forget his failure. The belt went together smoothly enough. The real test would be how it fed through the weapons mechanism. Mitchell loaded the belt into the MG-42, taking care to properly seat the first round. Then, holding his breath, he manually cycled the action. The first round stripped from the belt cleanly, the spent link ejected properly, the second round fed smoothly, then the third, fourth, fifth. Mitchell cycled through 20 rounds manually, and every single one fed without hesitation. It worked. The lamp wire spirals were actually working. Mitchell allowed himself a small smile, but he knew the real test would come under actual firing conditions. The stress of rapid fire, the heat, the vibration, all of these factors could reveal weaknesses that weren't apparent during manual cycling. He found Lieutenant Hayes at the command post, which was buzzing with unusual activity. Officers were huddled over maps, their faces grim. Hayes looked up when Mitchell entered. "Sir, I've got the MG-42 working. I'd like permission to test fire it." Hayes's expression was distracted. "Mitchell, I don't have time for this right now. We're getting reports of major German troop movements all along the line. Something big is happening." "All the more reason to test it now, sir. If we're about to see action, we need to know if this weapon is reliable." Hayes considered for a moment, then nodded. "Make it quick. Conserve ammunition. And Mitchell, if this works, you just might have saved some lives today." At the hastily constructed firing range behind their position, Mitchell set up the MG-42 on a captured German tripod. A small crowd had gathered, including Sergeant Kowalski and several other skeptics. Word had spread about the lamp wire repair, and most had come to witness what they assumed would be a spectacular failure. "$10 says it jams on the first burst," Jensen said loudly. "I'll take that bet," replied Corporal Danny Reeves, one of the few soldiers who had encouraged Mitchell's efforts. "The kid knows what he's doing." Mitchell loaded a belt of 50 rounds, checked the weapon one final time, and settled into a firing position. He took a deep breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The MG-42 erupted with its characteristic sound, a noise so fast and so loud that it didn't sound like individual shots, but rather like fabric being torn, a continuous, devastating roar. Tracer rounds arced downrange, striking the target logs and kicking up frozen earth. The belt fed through smoothly, the improvised wire spirals doing their job perfectly. Mitchell fired in short bursts, the way German machine gunners had been trained, conserving ammunition while maintaining maximum effectiveness. The weapon never hesitated, never faltered. Every round fed cleanly. The wire spirals held together despite the violent action of the weapon. When the belt was exhausted and the gun fell silent, there was a moment of stunned quiet. Then Corporal Reeves let out a whoop of triumph. "Pay up, Jensen. I told you the kid could do it." Even Kowalski looked impressed, though he tried to hide it behind a gruff exterior. "Well, I'll be damned, it actually works." Lieutenant Hayes approached, his expression serious despite the successful test. "Good work, Mitchell. Now I need you to show 2 other men how to operate this weapon. We're going to put it in the defensive line." "Sir, is something happening?" Hayes looked toward the dark tree line to the east, where the German positions lay hidden in the forest. "Division thinks the Germans might be planning a counterattack. Could be nothing, could be big. Either way, I want every weapon we have operational and manned." What no one in that small Belgian village knew was that they were standing at the northern shoulder of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last great offensive in the West. Within hours, hundreds of thousands of German troops would surge forward through the Ardennes, smashing into the thinly held American lines in a desperate gambit to split the Allied forces and capture the port of Antwerp. Mitchell spent the afternoon teaching Corporal Reeves and Private Sam Wolanski how to operate the MG-42. Both men were experienced machine gunners, so the learning curve was short. The main difference was the incredible rate of fire and the need to change barrels more frequently due to the heat. "This thing is a beast," Wolanski said admiringly, running his hand along the weapon's barrel. "I almost feel sorry for anyone who has to come at us while we're behind this." As darkness fell on December 16th, the men of the 99th Infantry Division prepared their positions. Most were young, newly arrived replacements who had never seen serious combat. They dug deeper into their foxholes, checked their weapons, and waited. Mitchell was assigned to help man the MG-42 with Reeves and Wolanski. They positioned the weapon at a critical crossroads, a point where German forces would almost certainly pass if they broke through the initial defensive lines. The captured German tripod gave them excellent stability and traverse, and they had managed to scrounge together nearly 800 rounds of German 7.92 mm ammunition from various sources. The temperature continued to drop as night deepened. Men stamped their feet and blew on their hands, trying to maintain circulation. Some talked quietly, nervous conversations about homes and families and what they would do after the war. Others sat in silence, lost in their own thoughts. Mitchell found himself thinking about his father's garage back in Gary, about lazy summer evenings spent tinkering with engines while the radio played baseball games. It seemed like a lifetime ago, like memories from someone else's life. War had a way of making the past feel distant and unreal, while the present moment, with all its cold and fear and uncertainty, felt like the only thing that had ever existed. Around 5:30 in the morning, the world exploded. The German artillery barrage was unlike anything the Americans had experienced. Hundreds of guns opened fire simultaneously, turning the dark forest into a hellscape of explosions and flying steel. Shells crashed into the American positions with terrifying precision. Trees shattered, sending splinters the size of knife blades through the air. The ground itself seemed to heave and buck. Mitchell pressed himself flat in the bottom of the foxhole, hands over his helmet, as the world tried to tear itself apart around him. The noise was beyond comprehension, a physical force that seemed to compress his chest and rattle his bones. He couldn't hear himself scream, couldn't hear anything except the endless thunder of high explosives. The barrage lasted for over an hour. When it finally lifted, the forest was transformed. Where there had been trees, now there were splintered stumps and tangles of fallen timber. Foxholes had collapsed. Communication lines were cut. Men emerged from cover, dazed and deafened, trying to assess the damage. "Here they come!" someone shouted, and Mitchell saw them, gray figures moving through the morning mist, hundreds of them advancing in disciplined waves. The German infantry were supported by armor, the distinctive shapes of Panther and Tiger tanks visible through the trees. The Americans opened fire with everything they had. Rifles cracked, machine guns stuttered, and mortars whooshed as they lobbed shells toward the advancing enemy. Mitchell, Reeves, and Wolanski manned their positions behind the MG-42. Through the mist and smoke, they could see a column of German infantry advancing directly toward their crossroads. The enemy moved with confidence, clearly expecting the American resistance to be minimal or non-existent. "Wait for it," Reeves said, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. "Let them get close. Make every round count." The Germans came closer, 200 yards, 175. "Now!" Reeves shouted. Wolanski, who was manning the gun, pressed the trigger, and the MG-42 roared to life. The effect on the advancing Germans was devastating. The weapon's incredible rate of fire created an almost solid wall of bullets. Men fell in windows cut down before they could even identify where the firing was coming from. The lamp wire spirals Mitchell's improvised repair performed flawlessly. The belt fed smoothly, despite the violent action of the weapon. Round after round cycled through the mechanism without hesitation. The German soldiers, ironically, were being cut down by their own weapon, firing their own ammunition, held together by wire from Belgian kerosene lamps. The German advance faltered, then broke. Men sought cover behind fallen trees and in shell craters. Their supporting armor couldn't advance through the dense forest and broken terrain. The American defensive line, despite being heavily outnumbered, held. But the battle was far from over. It was only the beginning. For 3 days, the fighting raged around Rocherath and the neighboring village of Krinkelt. The Germans threw regiment after regiment against the American positions, determined to break through and continue their drive west. The defenders, reinforced by elements of the 2nd Infantry Division, held on with desperate courage. The MG-42, with its lamp wire repair, fired thousands of rounds during those 3 days. Each time they reloaded, Mitchell held his breath, waiting for the improvised spirals to fail, but they never did. The lamp wire, formed by hand in a freezing barn, held together under conditions that would have challenged even factory-made components. Sergeant Kowalski, manning a nearby position with a Browning M1919, watched the MG-42 in action with newfound respect. During a brief lull in the fighting, he crawled over to Mitchell's position. "I owe you an apology, kid," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "I thought you were wasting your time with that lamp wire idea. I was wrong. That gun of yours has probably saved 50 lives in the past 2 days." Mitchell, exhausted and hollow-eyed from lack of sleep, just nodded. "It's not about being right or wrong, Sarge. It's about using what we have to stay alive." The defense of Rocherath-Krinkelt eventually forced the Germans to shift their attack route, delaying their advance by crucial days. This delay, multiplied across dozens of similar stands throughout the Ardennes, helped prevent the German offensive from achieving its objectives. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for over a month, but the outcome was decided in those first critical days when American forces, often outnumbered and outgunned, refused to break. Mitchell's MG-42 continued to function throughout the battle. The lamp wire spirals, subjected to heat, cold, dirt, and continuous stress, never failed. Other soldiers, hearing about the repair, began looking at damaged equipment with new eyes, wondering what other supposedly impossible fixes might be possible with creativity and determination. After the German offensive was finally beaten back, Lieutenant Hayes recommended Mitchell for a Bronze Star for his technical ingenuity and his courage under fire. The recommendation worked its way up through channels, gathering additional commendations from officers who had witnessed the weapon in action. But perhaps more important than any medal was the change in how Mitchell was viewed by his fellow soldiers. The mockery was gone, replaced by respect. When men had equipment problems, they brought them to Mitchell. When unconventional solutions were needed, they asked for his input. The lamp wire trip had become a legend in the unit, a story told to new replacements as an example of American ingenuity and determination. Years later, when military historians studied the Battle of the Bulge, they would focus on the big picture, the movements of divisions and corps, the decisions of generals and field marshals. Few would know about a young mechanic from Gary, Indiana, who spent 2 days in a freezing barn filing down lamp wire and winding it into spirals by hand. But the men who were there, the men who held those defensive positions in the Ardennes forest while German armor and infantry tried to overwhelm them, they remembered. They remembered the sound of that captured MG-42, its rate of fire so fast it sounded like tearing fabric. They remembered how it never jammed, never failed, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart around them. They remembered the lamp wire repair that shouldn't have worked, but did. Mitchell survived the war and returned to Gary, where he opened the repair shop he had always dreamed about. He never talked much about his wartime experiences, a trait common among his generation. But in his workshop, hanging on the wall above his workbench, was a section of German ammunition belt, held together by hand-formed wire spirals that gleamed dully in the fluorescent light. Occasionally, customers would ask about it, and Mitchell would smile his quiet smile and say it was just a reminder that problems are only impossible until you solve them. That with creativity, determination, and a willingness to try unconventional solutions, you could accomplish things that others said couldn't be done. He never mentioned that those wire spirals, formed from kerosene lamp handles in a Belgian barn during the coldest winter in decades, had helped hold a defensive line against an entire German division. He never talked about the men whose lives might have been saved because that weapon kept firing when others jammed or ran empty. But he kept that section of belt on his wall for 50 years, until his death in 1994. In his will, he left it to the United States Army Ordnance Museum, along with a letter explaining its history. The letter was brief and matter-of-fact, like Mitchell himself. It simply stated the problem he had faced, the solution he had devised, and the results it had produced. Today, that section of ammunition belt, with its hand-formed lamp wire spirals, sits in a glass case in the museum. The placard beside it tells the story of Private James Mitchell and his improvised repair. Visitors often pass it by, more interested in the tanks and artillery pieces and other impressive displays. But occasionally, someone stops, usually an engineer or a mechanic, someone who understands the challenge Mitchell faced. They lean close to the glass, studying those hand-formed spirals, marveling at the precision achieved with crude tools and improvised materials. They see not just a piece of wire, but a testament to human ingenuity under pressure. They see proof that sometimes the most important innovations don't come from factories or research laboratories, but from cold barns and desperate circumstances, from young men who refused to accept that a problem was unsolvable. They see the lamp wire repair that saved lives and helped turn the tide in one small corner of the largest battle the U.S. Army ever fought. And perhaps most importantly, they see a reminder that mockery and doubt often greet new ideas, especially in high-stakes situations where convention and tradition reign. But history belongs to those who persist despite the laughter, who continue working while others shake their heads, who believe that impossible is just another word for difficult. The Germans called the MG42 Hitler Saga, Hitler's saw, for the way it cut through enemy formations. But for the Americans who held the line at Roquebrath in December 1944, one particular MG42 had another nickname. They called it Mitchell's Lamp, a tribute to the mechanic who refused to give up and the improvised repair that kept it firing when it mattered most. The Battle of the Bulge was decided by many factors: strategic decisions, tactical brilliance, heroic sacrifices, and sheer determination all played their parts. But it was also decided by 1,000 small victories, 1,000 problems solved under pressure, 1,000 examples of soldiers making do with what they had. Private James Mitchell's lamp wire repair was just one of those 1,000 victories. But for the men who fought alongside him, for the men whose lives depended on that weapon functioning flawlessly under the most extreme conditions imaginable, it was the difference between life and loss. They laughed at his lamp wire trip until the feed never missed a tooth, and when the bullets started flying, when young men faced the choice between holding their ground or being overrun, that German machine gun, held together by American ingenuity and Belgian lamp wire, spoke with a voice that no one could ignore. In the end, that's what matters most. Not the mockery at the beginning, not the doubts and the skepticism. What matters is that when the test came, when lives hung in the balance, the impossible repair worked. The lamp wire held, the feed never missed a tooth. And somewhere in heaven, Mitchell's grandfather, the old railroad mechanic who taught him that problems are only impossible until you solve them, surely smiled with pride.